So we're going to switch gears a bit and talk about water quality for a while, which is of course related. We're talking about the same processes and impacts impacting both, and of course quantity. We're talking about stream flow. Lower flows would be generally related to higher levels, higher concentrations of many stream constituents, whether it's nutrients or contaminants. I could go the other way. Higher flows could be related to greater bank erosion and higher levels of at least sediment. So definitely some linkages. I'm putting on my Rob Hubbard hat and beard, and so Chuck is he's a biogeochemist. He's the expert on this stuff. Rob has been a co-investigator on this work. He's a forest ecologist and eco-hydrologist. I am a forester turned climate, water, paleoclimate guy. I'm really getting a little out of my depth talking about biogeochemistry and nutrient cycling. So any of you who are more familiar are welcome, truly, to pitch in, clarify, correct if needed, and I may ask for assistance in a few things. How do I get the slide to go forward? There we go. Okay, so these are some water quality issues that are common after forest disturbances across a wide variety of forest types and disturbances, whether it's forest harvest, it's fire, beetle infestation. One is nitrogen export, and nitrogen being the building block of proteins used by all living critters, and particularly increased levels of nitrates in streams. I'll talk about why that's a problem in a little bit. Increased dissolved organic carbon in streams, and then sedimentation from erosion associated with the initial disturbance. That varies a lot with the disturbance, or post-fire, which could be after an initial disturbance, or fire could be the disturbance, or erosion associated with some management related to an initial disturbance. So we'll talk of these. We're going to talk mostly about the nitrate issue, because that's been studied more in the lodgepole pine zone, and hopefully it's somewhat proportional to the concern among water managers and stream ecologists and fish biologists with nitrate levels, and I'll be curious to hear from some of you whether that's really the case. Anyway, beetle effects on water quality. You know what? I think I've actually start with this one. You have always the cycling going on between trees and other plants, and the soil. The nutrients are constantly cycling in between the soil reservoir and the reservoir in the vegetation itself, including nitrogen. And when you kill off a lot of the canopy trees, that uptake, part of the cycle, is cut off significantly. You're reducing 90, 100% of the basal area in a stand. You're having a very similar reduction in the uptake of nitrogen, at least right at first. And so you have excess in the soil, and when you have that excess in the soil, it's available to be leached out by precipitation, potentially reach streams, and elevate the nitrate levels and elevate other nutrient levels in the stream. Anything that's water soluble can be leached out. Now again, your understory, your residual, growing quickly with the increased growing space after the overstory is dead, will tend to take up the slack, and in the case of nitrate, will dampen the nitrate losses. In any system, after any disturbance, the overstory and understory and interaction with soil are modulated by these other abiotic factors. Temperatures, pretty much any chemical and most biological processes will occur faster when it's warmer. They'll generally occur faster when it's wetter. And so the rates of litter fall nutrient production, soil nutrient leaching have a lot to do with also the characteristics of the substrate, the mineral composition of the soil. So there's our happy graph again, and we would expect that to apply to water quality issues as well. And I think you guys were thinking of nitrate particularly. And there having been in the past very sharp and large observed responses in nitrate leaching from harvested stands and watersheds, and they were anticipating a delayed and dampened response in beetle-killed watersheds. So here's the kind of harvesting effects, clear cut. I think this is in lodgepole in either northern Colorado or southern Wyoming, and within sharply going up within a year or two and reaching a peak after 7 years and then slowly declining. But increase in nitrogen of, hard to tell because that first level is so low, but that could be 100-fold increases in nitrate leaching. And here, this is from Fraser Experimental Forest. This is showing that prolonged increase of nitrate present in the soil and available for leaching. 25 years after harvest, comparing untreated with a harvested stand. This has been regrowing for 25 years, and you still have this huge change or difference between the uncut forest and the treated, even after 50 years. So we know from observation that harvest treatments can cause significant effects to nutrient cycling that last a long time. So what about natural disturbances? Here's an example of an early study from the Appalachians in North Carolina, where you had a defoliating cankerworm that hit its stand in the early 1970s and causing much higher nitrogen, either nitrate concentrations in stream water, a seasonal cycle, bigger pulses with the spring melt, but the peaks are much higher than prior to the infestation, and there's some level of recovery after those trees refoliate. And then this, to some extent, similar species, Bavarian spruce, Picea like the Engelmann spruce, but a very different climate. This is in Germany, Bavarian spruce forest, where you had an Ips beetle attacking spruce, and index in, so it just takes a couple of years, and you have a very significant ramp up, 10 times higher post-outbreak. So actually it's pretty similar to a harvest response. And then a pretty quick recovery attributed to uptake by the understory. The understory, with that rapid regrowth, substituting for replacing that former nutrient cycling function of the spruce overstory. So again, we've shown this slide before. 2000, the mountain pine beetle outbreak. Transpiration and tree and stand water use dropped very quickly. And so one of the soil changes below dead trees, due to both transpiration and the additional snow accumulation, is here's your soil moisture between green, red, and gray phase. You can't see the gray, there's the top of it there. The soil moisture goes way up from under 10%, over 15% in the spring. And there's your nitrogen levels going up, elemental and ammonium and nitrate, especially nitrate, significantly increasing between green phase and then red and gray at this level. And so we've got lack of plant uptake. We've killed off a lot of the vegetation. Rapid nitrogen turnover in the soil with that vegetation loss. And then extensive litter inputs, the needle loss and the fine branches that are falling down as you go from red to gray, themselves contain nitrogen. So this is Green County. Okay, this is not at Fraser, but in that vicinity. And then changes in foliar nutrition. So this is showing as you're going from green to red phase that the amount of nitrogen that's in the needles of the beetle kill still on the tree, and the beetle kill lodgepole is declining. And then here's your residual living lodgepole picking up at least some of that slack in the nutrient cycling and finding so much more available in the soil, but not necessarily grabbing all of the excess from the dead trees. And so here's what happened in stream nitrate as it was monitored closely in 4 different basins in Fraser Experimental Forest. This is work led by Chuck Rose. And you can see a strong seasonal pulse with the highest levels with the spring melt before would be April and May and June. The decline as you get into the late summer low flows and coming back up a bit in the fall. Varying a lot, and this is an important point and relevant to the San Juans or really anywhere in the West or the world, is that prior disturbance and management history, the stand structure and composition, the soil aspect, those all play a big role in modulating the degree to which the nutrient cycling, the rates of nutrient cycling prior to the infestation and the impacts after infestation. But we can see that even though they had very different pre-infestation levels, afterwards there were not dramatic changes. In fact, slightly higher post-attack in St. Louis Creek. That's the most obvious one. Slightly higher at Lexington Creek. A little higher, at least in the spring months, in Dead Horse. A mix in Pool Creek. But nothing really dramatic, and minor relative to the atmospheric deposition of nitrogen that occurs all the time. Like 1%. So these are not changes, nor are the absolute levels of nitrate in stream that would be of concern to either stream ecosystems or human health. And here's from a synthesis study that Chuck led with several investigators that were pooling results from a bunch of different studies, and the name of the paper kind of says it all, Explaining a Weak Nitrate Response, that all of these investigators were finding across the lodgepole pine beetle zone in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming that they were not seeing the nitrogen leaching and levels in the stream that they were expecting to see. And they had a hard time getting this study published because it's basically a negative result. We didn't see what we expected to see. That's something a little bit about science publishing. They finally got it in there. But this is showing across 2 different studies that there was not really a relationship between nitrate levels in the stream post-infestation and the amount of overstoring mortality, from 0 to 100%, loss of basal area from 0 to about 75%. And you can see there was a lot of variability, and that probably mirrored the pre-infestation variability in the streams as well. The concentrations of nitrate were more strongly correlated with aspect, elevation, the amount of forest cover, precipitation over that particular basin or range, and the discharge, but weakly related to the amount of pine beetle infestation. So when you compare what has been observed across these several studies in the mountain pine beetle zone in Colorado in terms of nitrate changes post-disturbance. So here's these first 6 are tree harvests. Eastern U.S., Colorado, Sweden, Eastern U.S., Canada, partial tree harvest and slash burn. Those all involve increases in stream nitrate of 400% or more. Then you start getting into natural disturbances, it still increases 100% or more. Here's beetle kill, you can barely see the bar. It's less than 10% average across all these studies. It barely shows up. And this is just another way of showing the same data. A line of 0 increase decay for the Colorado beetle kill is sitting right on this line. The other disturbances, hundreds to, in some cases, 1,000%. A many tenfold increase. So, why? Again, the prevailing, it's hard to test this, but the prevailing idea is that the the understory. You could see in the tree ring data, you can see the growth response, the release. You can measure the height increase in the seedlings and saplings, and those have really taken up that slack, not just in the hydrologic cycle, but in the nutrient cycling as well. Now, how many of you, I know we've got at least one or two fish biologists in here, how many of you, part of your management scope of concern includes nitrate levels in streams? Two, maybe? And for you, it's human health, mainly? And aquatic life. And probably the impacts start at lower levels for the aquatics than for human health. And so related to, for the ecosystems, it's, the more nitrogen you have, the more algal and related productivity, you get eutrophication, you get oxygen loss, and the aquatic species get deprived of oxygen. Is that the main impact? Okay. And then for human health, at relatively higher levels, like the main concern is flu baby syndrome for infants. And some adults who are susceptible to that. That's human health. So maybe ecosystem health would be somewhere that we're expanding. What's that? 100 milligrams per liter. Okay, so in here. Yep. All right, thanks. So, yeah, this was not unlike, if we think about our stories and how expectations were developed based on analogous situations. We had people thinking, "Wow, we're going to see a big impact," and also, again, what do our eyes tell us? We have this enormous landscape scale impact. It's taking out trees over hundreds of thousands, in this case, several million acres, including most mature trees and entire watershed. That must have an impact on everything that goes on in the watershed. Well, yes, it's impacting multiple processes, but those might all end up kind of balancing out, and you end up with little net change in a particular object of concern. Dissolved organic carbon, obviously, when trees are dying, they're shedding a lot more carbon than when they're alive. And you get the litter, and you get branches, and you end up getting large branches, and you have the whole boles. Once they fall to the ground, they're starting to rot and release their carbon into soil and potentially into the stream. What we're seeing in some places in the mountain pine beetle zone, particularly when the red phase was at peak over the largest areas in the late 2000s, that there were some mountain communities seeing changes in water color, so aesthetic issues with the water, and also some odors. The more serious problem is that the humic forms of this dissolved organic carbon will react with chlorine and form disinfectant byproducts, including trihalometane, which is a carcinogen, and haloacetic acids. And these disinfectant byproducts of DDPs, those are significant health concerns. They're strictly regulated and limited. And so your municipal water suppliers have to keep a close eye on those. And I know, at least in Fort Collins, they had seen some levels that were of concern. Actually, this was a couple of years ago, and since then, the mountain pine beetle infestation has pretty much eaten its way out of lodgepole in northern Colorado, switched almost entirely into lower elevations in Ponderosa, and most of that in Larimer County. So hopefully Fort Collins is not getting worse, and they also have the fire. It's, again, always have some interacting things. You've got trends going on at multiple spatial scales. And in the case of dissolved organic carbon, globally, it's increasing in streams due to climate and precipitation chemistry generally getting a little more acidic, or in other ways that helps liberate carbon and bring it into streams. Are we seeing widespread consistent changes across the mountain pine beetle zone in dissolved organic carbon and these DEPs? There's just a study that came out a few months ago that compared treated water over time, kind of through the 2000s, or maybe from the mid-2000s to the present, from 8 different municipal water supplies in western Colorado in the Front Range. 4 that they kind of called controls that had relatively low levels of pine beetle, and 4 that were much more severely affected by pine beetle. And they found somewhat higher levels of dissolved organic carbon and much higher levels of disinfectant byproducts, mainly with trihalomethanes, in those 4 more severely affected watersheds compared to the controls. However, that's a small sample size to try to pull out a significant effect. And there's a lot of variability. I feel like I'm repeating this idea again and again and again. A lot of variability in dissolved organic carbon between the different beetle-affected watersheds. So among those 4 that they're trying to compare with their 4 controls. So again, you're trying to tease out a signal from a very spatially complex landscape in terms of both hydrology, in terms of nutrients. But it's definitely something to think about and watch for if you've got a treated water supply to manage. Also, this is a little more physically obvious and intuitive. When you've got host trees that are making up your riparian canopy, and you take those out, you will increase stream temperatures. And that will affect some aquatic species directly, including cold water fishery, and will affect water quality, again, by increasing the rate of chemical reactions and metabolism of organisms, some of which you want, some of which you don't want. And in western Colorado, John Stegnick at CSU has measured 2 degrees C, so over 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit increase in some stream segments. He's attributing just to the lack of shading post-infestation, where this would be in the mountain pine beetle zone, where lodgepole was the dominant riparian, like in that photo. So sedimentation. We'll think first about forest harvesting, and I have mentioned some of this already, or in passing, that you will always, obviously practices have changed, equipment has changed, but some compaction and disturbance of soils is unavoidable. The degree of erosion and stream sedimentation will depend on practices of the best management practices and on the soil, the geology, the slope steepness, the precipitation, the elevation, and so forth. In general, again, based on well-documented studies of harvesting, different practices, we could expect to see greater sedimentation risk from harvesting than from the beetle infestation alone, of which the experience so far, I don't have studies on it, but sort of the anecdotal experience from the mountain pine beetle infestation is there's very little erosion problem just from the infestation. And there's been some concern that as you have tree fall and roots rot out where trees were part of the vegetation holding soil onto steeper slopes, you would get more erosion. It's not really happening. Again, I think the understory, that's another slack that the understory is taking up, not just trees but other vegetation. As they respond to that growing space, they're now holding the soil onto these steeper slopes. I've not been hearing about significant erosion problems just from infestation alone in the absence of management. So another significant sedimentation problem, and of course I don't have a slide on it because I'm going to let Scott speak to this, would be related to fire. And this was kind of brought home. I'll tell a story from last night when we did a much shorter, condensed version of all this for a group in about 45 minutes in Pagosa. And one person asked, how can you show us this stuff, which he saw as relatively, if not trivial, modest problems with disinfectant byproducts and nitrate and so forth, when you think about what happened in Durango after the Missionary Ridge fire, the sedimentation, post-fire erosion. And yeah, that's an enormous water quality problem. That's something you have with fire generally. Is that, should we call that a beetle problem or a beetle risk? And so that's kind of where I'll leave it to Scott to talk about the beetle-fire relationship right after me and take up that question of, is beetle kill a water quality issue related to sedimentation with fire as the go-between? I'll leave that for now. for Scott. Just in general, as the infestation progressed in northern Colorado with the pine beetles, and you were getting, not just your slopes, killed, but you're doing the salvage harvesting, and you leave these riparian buffers that are either already dead or are about to be killed. Is that sufficient? Are best management practices enough in a beetle outbreak environment, in that context where all the trees are being killed, and also for right-of-way clearing? So again, no great answers, but something to think about as management is being considered. That your buffer is probably less effective than alive. So the take-home messages. First, with respect to stream nitrate, in the mountain pine beetle zone, not seeing changes that would present problems for either human water use or aquatic ecosystems, at least systematically across the landscape. We could have individual watersheds that see spikes of nitrate that might be a problem for aquatic invertebrates, but nothing where you say, wow, that's a big problem, and not nearly as much as was expected. The mountain pine beetle infestation may be causing some DOC disinfectant byproduct increases that are in fact water quality issues. And again, changes, in this case in nutrient use and export, depend on a lot of factors: the extent of mortality, species composition, there's your understory response, and then any management action that might be taken afterwards. So my thinking, and this is me as a forester turned paleoclimatologist, not a water quality expert, but it seems like it would be prudent to monitor nitrate levels and DOC and disinfectant byproducts, and it would be, given I know what budgets are, it would be nice to enlist the research community. And I know the USGS, Colorado State, CU, managed to get the federal and other resources to carry out the work in the pine beetle zone. If there were a demand for that same kind of water quality monitoring in the spruce beetle zone, I think a good case could be made, and I think those researchers and entities would respond. Let us know if we as Western Water Assessment can help facilitate that. And that is all I have about those water quality issues. Does anyone have any questions about those? So how many of you would say water quantity is your bigger concern here? Yeah, that's totally understandable, and that actually is consistent with what we saw at our last workshop in Salt Lake City. So, okay. There are no questions, comments from any of you who are concerned about water quality? Are there other things we're missing in the water quality arena? That you're
related to the quantity.
Yeah.
Given more situation, so that kind of an increase, expected increase, how long generally for the channels, stream channels, enough for the basins to restabilize?
That's a great question. Let's take that up in discussion. And not being a stream geomorphologist, I don't have a good handle on that. But there would have to be that adjustment to a new flow regime if there were a large enough increase consistently. Yeah, especially with the base flows. That's a good question. We pulled that over.